Railroads in the 1860s were getting faster, heavier, and longer, but the brakes hadn't kept up. The only thing standing between a loaded freight train and catastrophe was a handful of men scrambling across rooftops in the dark, cranking iron wheels by hand while the ground rushed past beneath them. One wrong step and they were gone. That problem was about to meet a 22-year-old from Pennsylvania. Subscribe now to see how one invention changed railroads forever. Before compressed air changed everything, stopping a train was a physical act that fell on the shoulders of men called brakemen. Their job had almost nothing to do with riding in a comfortable cab. When the engineer blew the whistle signal for brakes, brakemen climbed wooden ladders bolted to the sides of freight cars, hauled themselves onto the running boards along the car roofs, and ran from car to car cranking individual brake wheels by hand. Each wheel tightened a set of brake shoes against the wheels below through a mechanical linkage. Do it enough times across enough cars, and eventually, maybe the train slowed down. The physics involved made this genuinely terrifying. A loaded freight train moving at 30 miles per hour carried kinetic energy on a scale that required half a mile or more of track to bleed off even under ideal conditions. Ideal conditions almost never existed. Rain made wooden running boards slick, snow covered them entirely, darkness hid gaps between cars, high winds pushed men sideways. Icy steel ladder rungs bit into ungloved hands until the feeling disappeared entirely, along with the ability to grip anything reliably. The braking itself was uneven by design. Brakemen couldn't reach every car simultaneously, so the cars at the front slowed before the cars at the rear. This created violent lurching that could snap couplings, telescope cars into each other, and throw brakemen from their perches onto the roadbed below. Mountain grades turned these problems into genuine nightmares, where trains accelerated faster than brakemen could respond, and runaway situations developed within seconds of losing control. The human cost was staggering. In some periods during the latter half of the 19th century, roughly 1 in every 120 railroad workers was killed on the job annually. Thousands more were maimed, crushed between cars, or simply fell from moving trains and were never seen again. Brakemen suffered frostbite so severe that fingers came off. Fractures from falls were considered routine occupational hazards. It was among the most dangerous jobs in the entire country, and everyone in the railroad industry knew it and largely accepted it as the unavoidable price of moving freight across a continent. The expansion that followed the Civil War made everything worse. Trains grew from managed links to 50, 70, even 100 cars loaded with coal, grain, or livestock. Each additional car added weight, momentum, and one more brake wheel that somebody had to reach and crank by hand before the situation became unrecoverable. The Angola horror of 1867, where a passenger train plunged into a creek gorge after a derailment, killed 49 people and horrified the public. But nothing structural changed. More brakemen were hired, ladders were improved slightly, the industry kept moving and kept killing its workers at the same reliable rate. So, if climbing rooftops in ice storms was the best solution anyone had, what exactly had everyone else already tried? The railroad industry wasn't entirely passive about the braking problem. It tried things. None of them worked well enough to matter. The most straightforward response was simply hiring more brakemen, putting more bodies on more cars so that the cranking could happen faster across a longer train. This helped at the margins without solving anything fundamental. More men meant more people at risk of falling. It didn't change the physics of uneven application or the impossibility of simultaneous braking across a 100-car train. Paying more wages to employ more brakemen also didn't appeal to railroad management accountants who were already watching costs closely. Engineers learned to use the locomotive itself as a partial braking tool by reversing the steam admission to the cylinders, a technique called plugging. This created resistance through the drivetrain that slowed the locomotive into the train while the rear kept pushing forward from its own momentum. It worked sometimes and made situations worse other times, depending on how the train was loaded and what the grade looked like. It required skill and timing that not every engineer possessed equally. Whistle signals coordinated the effort as best they could. A specific sequence of blasts told brakemen to apply their wheels, but those signals traveled at the speed of sound through open air while the train traveled underneath them. The brakeman at the rear of a long train might hear the signal a second or more after the brakeman at the front, which added to the unevenness of the application that already made stopping so unpredictable. Infrastructure filled some of the gaps where braking technology couldn't. Mountain railroads built escape sidings at intervals along steep descending grades. Short spurs angled slightly uphill where a runway could be steered to let momentum bleed off without a crash. Sand pits placed before bridges gave engineers a last option if brakes failed completely. These solutions acknowledged the problem without eliminating it, essentially designing the landscape around a braking system that everyone knew was inadequate. By the mid-1860s, the brakeman's position was recognized throughout the industry as one of the most dangerous occupations in America. Newspapers covered railroad accidents regularly. Compensation claims mounted. None of this produced a technical solution because no one had yet figured out how to apply force simultaneously to every wheel on a long train from a single point of control. But one young man wasn't reading accident reports. He was reading something far more unexpected: mining manuals. George Westinghouse was 21 years old in 1867, already holding patents for devices that helped re-rail cars that had jumped the track. Selling those devices brought him into regular contact with railroad superintendents and motive power officials across the northeastern United States, and those conversations changed what he thought his career should be about. He'd been born in 1846 in Central Bridge, New York, the son of a farm machinery manufacturer who taught him that mechanical problems had mechanical solutions if you looked at them correctly. The Civil War interrupted his education and gave him practical experience with machinery and pressure systems. When he returned to civilian life, he moved quickly from idea to patent to sales, demonstrating an ability to see a problem and engineer his way through it that would define everything he accomplished afterward. The re-railing business exposed him to the deeper problem. Railroad officials told him repeatedly and directly that getting derailed cars back on the track was a nuisance. Stopping trains before they derailed was the real crisis. Brakemen died in numbers that the industry couldn't explain away indefinitely. Accidents that should have been prevented kept happening because the time between seeing a problem and being able to respond to it was simply too long across a train that stretched for half a mile. The specific incident that crystallized his thinking involved a head-on collision where both engineers reportedly saw the situation developing and did everything available to them. The brakemen couldn't reach their wheels in time. The trains hit at speed, and people died who might have lived if braking force could have been applied across both trains simultaneously and immediately. Westinghouse had been reading about European mining operations that used compressed air to power drilling equipment. Air could be stored under pressure, released on demand, and transmitted through pipes across significant distances without losing its force. If you could run a pipe along the length of a train and fill it with compressed air from the locomotive, then release that air into brake cylinders on each car simultaneously, every set of brakes on the train would apply at the same moment the engineer made a single decision. The idea was simple enough to sketch on paper. Making it actually work on a real train was something else entirely. Westinghouse filed his first air brake patent on April 13, 1869, receiving U.S. patent number 88,929. He was 22 years old. He also founded the Westinghouse Air Brake Company in Pittsburgh that same year, securing funding from a merchant named Ralph Bagley, who recognized both the commercial potential and the genuine need the invention addressed. The system was straightforward in concept. A steam-driven air compressor on the locomotive filled a main reservoir with compressed air. Continuous brake pipe ran the length of the train through flexible hose connections between cars. When the engineer opened the control valve in the cab, compressed air flowed through the pipe into brake cylinders mounted on each car, pushing pistons that applied brake shoes against the wheels. Release the valve, air exhausted from the cylinders, springs pulled the brake shoes away, and the brakes released. This was dramatically better than anything that had existed before. One engineer controlled every brake on the train from the locomotive cab. No brakemen needed to risk their lives on rooftops in any weather. Application happened in seconds rather than minutes. The Pennsylvania Railroad began equipping passenger trains with the system around 1870, and the initial results justified the investment quickly enough that other major railroads paid attention. The compelling demonstration came during an early test run on a Pennsylvania railroad line. A wagon loaded with iron appeared on the tracks ahead of a passenger train equipped with the new brakes. The engineer applied the air, the train stopped in time, and the wagon driver escaped unhurt. The story spread through the industry with the speed that only a genuinely impressive result could generate. One dramatic stop impressed the whole industry, but a hidden flaw in the design could make things far more deadly. The straight air brake sent compressed air from the locomotive through the pipe to apply the brakes. This logic created a vulnerability that made the system dangerous in exactly the situations where brakes mattered most. If a hose connection between cars failed, if the train broke in two, if any couplings separated, air pressure in the brake pipe dropped. The cars behind the brake point lost their brakes entirely. A runaway section of the train separated from the locomotive with no way to stop it was arguably more dangerous than no automatic brakes at all, because everyone assumed the brakes would work. Westinghouse solved this with his 1872 patent, filed on March 5th, and assigned patent number 124,405. The automatic air brake inverted the entire logic of the system. Rather than sending air to apply the brakes, the system kept the brake pipe continuously pressurized to hold the brakes off. Every car carried its own auxiliary air reservoir that charged continuously from the main brake pipe. A device called the triple valve on each car monitored brake pipe pressure constantly. When the engineer reduced brake pipe pressure, either gradually for normal service braking or suddenly for emergency application, the triple valve on each car sensed the drop and used the pressure stored in the car's auxiliary reservoir to apply the brake cylinder. Every car responded to the pressure drop simultaneously, regardless of where it occurred in the train. If a hose ruptured, if a coupling failed, if any part of the train separated, brake pipe pressure dropped automatically and every car's brake applied without any action from anyone. Flipping the logic saved the invention, but how exactly did this clever little valve actually make decisions mid-journey? Understanding why the automatic air brake succeeded requires a brief look at what the triple valve actually did. Because it was the engineering heart of the entire system, the locomotive carried a steam-powered air compressor that kept a main reservoir at operating pressure. The brake pipe connected every car on the train through rubber hose couplings that flexed with the movement of the train. Each car had its own auxiliary reservoir that stayed charged from the brake pipe during normal operation and a brake cylinder that actually pushed the brake shoes against the wheels. The triple valve sat between these components and made three decisions based on brake pipe pressure. When brake pipe pressure was stable and high, the valve kept the brake cylinder exhausted and the auxiliary reservoir charging. When the engineer made a service application by reducing brake pipe pressure moderately, the triple valve isolated the auxiliary reservoir from the brake pipe and connected it to the brake cylinder, applying brakes proportionally to how much pressure the engineer removed. When brake pipe pressure dropped rapidly, indicating an emergency, the triple valve triggered a full application using everything stored in the auxiliary reservoir. The graduated release meant engineers could modulate braking force for speed control on descending grades rather than choosing between full brakes and no brakes. This level of control transformed mountain operations from a constant battle with gravity into something that experienced engineers could manage with precision. An 1887 refinement called the Quick Action Triple Valve addressed a remaining limitation on very long trains. When the engineer made an emergency application, the pressure wave traveling through the brake pipe reached the rear of a 100-car train several seconds after the front cars had already stopped moving. The quick action valve accelerated this propagation by venting brake pipe pressure locally when it detected the initial drop, speeding the emergency signal to the rear of the train far faster than the pressure wave alone could travel. The mechanics worked beautifully on paper. What happened when real railroads actually put it on their trains? The practical effects of the automatic air brake appeared immediately wherever railroads adopted the system. Stopping distances compressed from half a mile or more to a fraction of that figure. Engineers gained complete control of their trains without dependence on signals to men they couldn't see. The entire chain of command that had coordinated braking across a moving train became unnecessary overnight. Brakemen survived in large numbers for the first time. Injuries from falls on wet running boards dropped sharply where the system replaced manual brakes. Frostbite cases declined because men weren't required to spend hours on car roofs in winter weather cranking brake wheels until their hands stopped working. The death toll that had been accepted as routine began falling in the communities around major railroad terminals. Operationally, railroads discovered they could run faster schedules because shorter stopping distances allowed closer following distances between trains. Heavier loads became manageable because the braking system scaled with the train length rather than becoming exponentially more difficult as cars were added. Mountain grades that had required extensive helper locomotive operations and careful descent management became more routine with graduated air brake control available to every engineer. The shift of braking control entirely to the locomotive cab also changed how railroads organized their crews. The brakeman's primary role on moving trains largely disappeared, reducing labor costs while simultaneously improving safety. The remaining brakemen focused on switching operations in yards where their skills remained relevant, rather than risking their lives on moving freight trains. Faster, safer, and cheaper, so why did it take another decade before every train finally had one? Despite results that clearly demonstrated the value of automatic air brakes, railroad adoption moved slowly outside of passenger service through the 1870s and into the 1880s. The reasons were financial rather than technical. Retrofitting an entire freight car fleet cost real money. A railroad operating thousands of cars faced enormous capital expenditure to equip each one with brake cylinders, triple valves, auxiliary reservoirs, and the hose connections required to integrate with the locomotive system. Passenger cars got brakes quickly because the political and reputational cost of passenger deaths was immediate and visible. Freight cars were a different calculation, and the men who died on freight train rooftops had less political voice than the passengers who bought tickets. Interoperability complicated matters further. A car equipped with Westinghouse brakes from one railroad had to couple with cars from other railroads and function correctly within a mixed train. Standardizing hose connections, fittings, and operating pressures required coordination across competing companies that had little incentive to cooperate voluntarily. Lorenzo Coffin, an Iowa farmer who had witnessed brakeman injuries firsthand and dedicated years to advocating for mandatory safety equipment, pushed the issue into public consciousness and eventually into Congress. The Burlington Railroad conducted systematic brake tests in 1886 and 1887 that compared manual braking against automatic air brakes on a long freight train descending a grade. The results weren't even close. The Railroad Safety Appliance Act passed in 1893 and required automatic air brakes and automatic couplers on all interstate trains, with full compliance phased in by around 1900. Universal adoption followed the mandate. By the early 20th century, the basic system Westinghouse had patented in 1872 equipped essentially every railroad car in North America, and the design spread internationally across railroads that recognized its value. The law forced the change, but what did Westinghouse himself leave behind when the dust finally settled? The Westinghouse Air Brake Company grew into one of the major industrial enterprises of the 20th century, eventually becoming Wabco and later merging into Wabtec Corporation, which remains a major supplier of railroad equipment today. The core principle of the 1872 patent survives in every freight train currently operating across North America. The specific hardware has been refined with electronic controls and improved materials, but the fundamental logic of a pressurized brake pipe that holds brakes off and applies them when pressure drops remains unchanged from what Westinghouse patented more than 150 years ago. The runaway sidings and escape tracks that dotted mountain grades across the continent became largely obsolete within a generation of mandatory air brake adoption. Some survive today as emergency backup, but their original purpose, catching trains that had lost all braking capability, became unnecessary once every car carried its own fail-safe reservoir and triple valve. The landscape of American mounting railroad changed because the physics of stopping finally matched the physics of moving. Trucks, buses, and heavy vehicles eventually adopted pneumatic braking systems built on the same principles Westinghouse developed for trains. The fail-safe logic that made his design superior to the straight air brake became the foundational assumption of heavy vehicle braking everywhere, that vehicles carried loads too large for hydraulic systems to handle reliably. George Westinghouse went on to build an industrial empire that included alternating current electrical systems developed in competition with Thomas Edison. But the air brake remained the invention that defined what kind of engineer he was. He saw a problem that was killing people unnecessarily, identified the physical principle that could solve it, and built a company around the solution before he turned 23. The men who no longer had to run across train rooftops in January to crank iron wheels in the dark couldn't write him thank you letters. The fact that they survived to complain about other things was thanks enough. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the inventors and the machines that built the modern world and the problems they solved that everyone else had given up on.